gets dissolved, because then who is the subject?
The India's Most Trusted Brand of the Year Awards 2024 with the first award category, which is Best UGC NET JRF English Coaching in Delhi by Vineet Pandey. It goes to Professor Vineet Pandey.
दिल्ली में सीएमपी द्वारा दूसरा अंतर्राष्ट्रीय सम्मेलन डॉक्टर दीक्षा त्रिपाठी ने थैनेटोपॉलिटिक्स पर चर्चा की।
Now, as we continue to reflect on the multifaceted theme of thanatopolitics and the posthuman, it is my honor to invite Professor Shaubhodeep Paul, Assistant Professor at Bankura University. Professor Paul's research spans posthumanism, critical theory, and contemporary cultural studies, and he has consistently shed light on how narrative shapes and reshape our understanding of life, mortality, and human transformation in the age of technology.
Today, he will be delivering his keynote address on the fascinating theme, Mute, Able or Mutable, Techno-Digital Mutations of the Death Clock in the Fourth Dimension. This thought-provoking subject promises to challenge our perspectives and open new horizons of dialogue.
Let us welcome Sir with a huge round of applause.
Thank you, Diksha. Thank you, Vinay. Thanks to the entire team of CMP for asking me to come over to Delhi. And I'm really happy to be here, especially in the company of some of the people I've grown up with and some of the people I deeply admire. To begin with, let me wax biographical a bit, because it's not even been a fortnight since I lost my father. And it's quite ironical that I have to speak a few words or say a few words on death, the ideations of death, and the different predilections that come or emerge from death. Having said that, I would like to say that despair is indeed the catchphrase of my personal life at this moment, because I'm reminded of the final chapter of Lawrence's Sons and Lovers, which is called Derelict. And sometimes, as it happens that we are in a condition which is neither living nor dead, nor typically life in death, the Coleridgean way, but in a situation which is in the contestation of being derelict. And from there, I would like to, make certain postulations. The theorizing of it has been very well taken care of by Shogotoda. And I would like to kind of, dwell on certain aspects that I have been kind of, researching on since 2015, ever since this area became a niche favorite of mine. I met Diksha. Diksha came over to the Center for Research in Posthuman Studies in my university, and ever since then, we have been toying with how to go beyond the quotidian understanding of posthuman studies, especially the non-Western part of it, which I guess is a bit discounted. I have 2 points of hypothesis or postulation. Point A, which is how to analyze posthuman encounters with death, and point B, how death itself influences the posthuman project. Now, to do that, the first thing that definitely comes to our mind is this, that death education in the West has been pretty different from the idea of death education as it has been handed over to us through centuries in this part of the world. And quite obviously, death psychology itself is also quite multimodal, I should say, compared to the idea of, its acceptance in the West. But then once again, I wouldn't want to fall in a binaristic trap between the West and the non-West, because my basic contention has been to come over a kind of Manichaean straitjacketing or binaristic perception of anything whatsoever. Because as you know, posthuman studies is pretty post-binary, so to say. So we'll be talking about those gray areas, and I can assure you that they are much more than 50 shades. So there are many kind of, areas to touch upon. But primarily, the ontoepistemic psychosis of death itself is quite challenging in terms of an ideological perception of it, I've never been to a crematorium. I've helped people whose folks have died, but this is the first time I've been, and I have, despite being not a very upright religious person, but I have very judiciously performed all the rites and rituals. And couple of things I'd like to dwell on before I come to the main part of my paper, which is this, that there are several stages, I'm basically talking about Hinduism, but there are several stages that we pass through, The first day where, the main part, which is this, that the person has to be cremated. So you have to surrender the mortal remains to fire. And after that, the next 4 days, Chaturthi, which has the second phase of, celebrating the person's life. And then you have the Shraddha ceremony, which is 13 days or 15 days, usually happen to be a month. And then after that, that particular day, the next day, you have the Niyom Bhango, or you have the breaking of your ritualistic practice, which is usually to do with non-veg, consumption, and also a kind of celebration where you invite people to come over and participate in your grief, bereavement, mourning, whatever you call it. But one thing I've noticed in this case is this, that, in case of non-Hinduistic perceptions, I'll lay Zoroastrianism aside for a moment because that has a mix of both. It's usually the idea of entombment of the dead, okay? Whereas in Hinduism, I have seen that it's basically in terms of a release, the release of the Atma from the body. And I was asked by the priest that, would you want to be sad, or would you want to come out of this sadness? What is your perception of it? And I said that I have been as sad as possible, and I have cried for a complete hour because he was very close to me. And now I really want to have him at peace and have myself and my family at peace. And then I was told that we don't actually feel sad for the dead body. Do you feel sad for the dead body? Do you feel sad for the corpse, so to say, quote unquote? We don't, because you can preserve the corpse in ways more than one. And that is where, the technological aspect would come in handy, which is cryogenics and cryonics and stuff like that has become a buzzword. Though there are other aspects to it, which I'll come to later. Then what are we lamenting when a person passes away? Who is it that is doing this talking, having this feeling, getting some ideas transpired? It is the Atma, or the soul, so to say. And this has a passage. This has several passages, so to say, okay? And it's like when Yamraj comes, I'm being a little metaphysical here, I understand. It's not the habitual way I address lectures, but still, I can't help it, that there are 14 departments that you cross through before you attain Swarglok. And which obviously is in keeping with high physics these days, to say that there are several dimensions of reality, several perceivable dimensions and several not so perceivable dimensions. And I feel that, my perception as a human subject, where my faculties are limited within a specific zone that cannot outlast the infrared capacities and the ultraviolet capacities. I'm confined to that mid zone. to say that I'm a very limited creature. The human would be very limited compared to the non-human, because this has been a millennium of turns. There's the plastic turn, there's the post-human turn, there's the animal turn. In particular, there's the non-human turn. So why have we focused on the non-human? Because to make things clear, death ritualization has a lot to do with the non-human. If you do not make the non-human a part of your ceremony, then the task is incomplete. When you offered the Pindodan, it has to be consumed by the non-human. The crows, the ants, so on and so forth. And at the same time, I could see that in front of his pandal there were some dogs who came out of nowhere. I didn't pet them, and they were all like sitting very quietly and stuff like that. Now this might be an accident, this might be a coincidence, that the whole thing is debatable. I don't want to get into the Kung Fu Panda debate, but the thing is this, that perhaps there is a perception which is beyond the sensory, which I think the non-human is more capable of dealing with. And that is the reason why we have had certain animals designated in certain cultures that were carriers of the dead to the other realms that they had to visit. And most importantly, what I also understood is the fact that, passage is not random, because, the soul hovers around its favorite places for certain days. Those are precarious days. The living is said to be very careful, be very careful at that point of time. And after that, when you get back to, your normal life, so to say, then you have to make pact with the living. By making pact with the living, I mean that you have to accept certain materialities which are part of your conditioning, without which you can't go on. And that way we accept that material reality as an objective theorized reality that we have. And this is where I think that in post-human studies, there is a major schism. There is a schizoid. Once again, a binaristic trap, but nonetheless there is. Because quite obviously, posthumanism talks about certain things in certain ways. Transhumanism talks about certain things in some other ways. And, like I have interviewed Francesca, I've talked with Rosie. They all initially come from the same school, but then, their specializations take them to different aspects of understanding the human. But one of the key features of humanism has been a kind of, if not negation, a kind of disbelief in the afterlife. This has been the mainstay, of humanistic, exposure. But any kind of ethico-moral decision, which is based on reason and egalitarianism, has to have the maintenance of certain boundaries, which is what posthumanism tries to do. Is it tries to get over those binaries. And quite interestingly, I found out that because for a long time we have also been scholars of post-colonialism and post-structuralism and stuff, postmodernism and stuff that came, slightly before this became a buzzword, and where hybridity was also valorized at one point of time. So if you have had too much of attention paid to the subject, then, you had a lot of attention paid to the other after a certain point of time. But here, the main question itself gets dissolved, because then who is the subject, who is the other? How do we valorize that a certain species called the Homo sapiens, who came after a certain point of evolution, who defeated 3 other species of their same brood through not very human characteristic features, and they attained a certain spine, they attained a certain cranial content, and they came to be valorized as the roof and crown of all creation, Tennyson. So I challenge this anthropocentric idea, this very anthropocentrism, and I believe that after a certain point of time, what happens is this, that the human in the Anthropocene has come to such a phase where it has been able to do a lot of modulations, but at the same time, it has not been able to get over its basic limiting principle, which is mutability, which is mortality in itself. Okay, so that's how I titled the paper, that like mute are, that we are currently in the mute mode, which is not to say that we are not live, but we are in the mute mode. And then comes the question of ability, human ability, which is increasingly getting challenged every day thanks to technogenesis, and the very aspect of mutability. How do we confront that? If you remember Philip Larkin's poem Once, this costly aversion from the eyes of death. We are perpetually trying to evade death in some way or the other. Our life insurances, our body pampering, everything to do with it is perennially an escape from death. But I guess, like as Shaubhodeep also pointed out, that it's this very confrontation of death which is so interesting, because Eros and Thanatos happens to be on the pendulum shift. Thanatos is the extreme end of it, and if you touch Thanatos very deeply, then you would tend to be suicidal. If you are too erotic, then you would have a problem adjusting with reality. So I'm trying to take a middle ground, and by that I mean that there are necropolitical realities which we are confronting today, and where death has become a fashion, a buzzword, a normality, a habitual to-do experience, which kind of, is simply something to get over with instead of trying to understand better. So maybe a 3-4 days bereavement leave wouldn't do much good anyway, because sometimes we don't want to forget certain things, Memorialization, which is an objective reality. You can have the Victoria Memorial, you can have the India Gate, that's something. But memory, which is not objective, which is not object-based, it has a variation with object-oriented ontology. It is fluid. Memory is something which is working wonders. And that's the reason why I think that the best thing that you can have to attain peace is to have the right kind of memory with the right kind of things. So in this context, I had a small PPT. Is it there? Like, just want to show a few slides so that it is more imagistic that way. Like, till you do that, I'll just continue with it. So with this conflation of ideas, I believe that posthumanism is not just a postmortem of human body overdrive. It is a deconstructive post-structuralist approach to the ethics of creation, sustenance and destruction. Because the techno-critical domain lies in the transhumanist camp. That is where all the mind uploading part, the cryogenic part, the stem cell preservation part, that is all coming up. And this is quite interesting, because I think that, the digital domain of preservation has, yeah, please. Just turn to page 1. I need to show them. The first page. Come to slide 1. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I very recently watched a movie called Nirbak. That's a very normal, not so hyped up movie, Bengali movie, and which basically has to do with the idea of wordlessness. Okay, and you have several agencies. You have a dog, a female dog, and you have a dead patient. You have a couple whose lives are not working properly, and you have a tree which wants to be the lover of a woman. So you have a crossover of the human and the non-human. The basic idea is, when logos itself is failing, then how do we explain this, variant or this situation where, any kind of experiential reality would have a tough time in defining itself. Shaubhodeep was talking about the compost idea, which I think is very interesting because, it goes beyond all the posts that we have studied so far. It's the ultimate, mixture or churning of everything. And from there, I think that, it can be a very difficult, postulation or hyperpostulations with the idea of death, which is not easy or which is not unidimensional in any culture, so to say. You look at this slide, this is a very brief presumption on the idea of death as a waking, So when we die, we actually wake up. And it's a failure of the living to realize that for the deceased. So there is a brief insight into the problem, and then there is a solution to it, And the solution is based on certain cryogenic watercolors which show the state of the inside of the cranium when a person actually dies. So that is to say that when we are living, we are actually pretty black and white. It is only when the body reaches a certain cessation that the mind accelerates and the mind obtains that release. I would say that's not just the mind, but that is the combination of the mind and the soul, which traditionally used to be referred to as the psyche. So it's that kind of a domain that there is a waking up to. Please remember, death is not the end of things. Shaubhodeep also pointed that out. But it is also the beginning of alternate realities. Okay? And from there, I will come to a technological concept called the idea of the death clock, which is part of my paper, which is to say that it's pretty much an AI-based app which calculates your longevity, which calculates the kind of life you might have, how strong you would be to do certain things, and how you would meet your end. Roughly at what point of time your body would collapse, and for what kind of reasons, based on what kind of life you have led. And to know that, it would be pretty easy for you to configure your set of priorities. Because then death is not the end of things, but death is an indicator of how you lead your life, what kind of priorities you have for your life. Let me give you a very bizarre example. It sounds ridiculous at times to me, but still is worth pointing out, that my own grandfather, my father's dad, he died at the age of 51. He was an extremely sattvic individual. He led a very pious life, and he died at the age of 51. His brother, my Kaka Dadu, he died at 88. And there was not a single substance abuse that he did not get addicted to. Now, how do I come to a conclusion with it? I come to a conclusion with it because our longevity plan has a lot to do with the perceptions we have set for ourselves. How we perceive ourselves, how we perceive aging, how we counter aging, what are the kind of things we want to do and what are the things we don't want to do. So this death clock mechanism becomes so important. This is to do with the fact that we have three-dimensional experiences. We are locked in a three-dimensional setup, because as Einstein pointed out, that there is that space-time configuration. It's not just a time sequence at work, because time is always going away from our grasp, but it is the conflation of space and time that actually decides things for us. But at the same time, the problem is this, that we can never get a holistic grasp of it from the fourth dimension. The fourth dimension always eludes us. Okay? So it's like as it happens in theater, as it happens in drama, that the fourth wall reality is out there. But at the same time, you really are not meant to participate in that. That's a kind of, visible, invisible shield. And it permeates into your normal conscience and consciousness. So this is how, the death clock is an indication of how our gerontological futures are being examined. Why do I talk about gerontological features and geriatric features? The reason is because human medicine now has reached that kind of a state where you can prolong your life indefinitely to a very big extent, depending on, of course, how much money you have and how much you are a believer of Western medicine. You can prolong your life indefinitely. But one of my target plans was, my father just had a creatinine problem. He had no other problem. His sugar, pressure, everything was fine. He just had a creatinine problem. But if you have one major problem in your body, you can get a multi-organ collapse. Okay? So my plan was to take care of him as much as possible till a pre-dialysis state comes. I am not a firm believer of dialysis, because dialysis is actually a semi-comatose state of existence, and he was already an octogenarian person. So from 69 till 84, I kept him well as much as I could, and then the medicines stopped working. I gave him pain alleviation, which is the best therapy that I could. I gave him company, I gave him his good times, and as you understand that this translates slowly into vascular dementia, which is one type of the different kinds of mind collapses that you have. Now, others in the family were not liking this because he could not relate to his immediate reality. But I took this as an opportunity. I talked to him about the things that mattered to him in his youth, in his heyday. And I got them recorded because they were chronicles that would otherwise die with him. I made him talk about that. Like, I'll give you an example. I paid a visit to the nursing home, and he woke up early in the morning. And as it is with nursing homes, early in the morning, there are several clamor going on here and there, utensils, nurses coming over. There's a lot of sound. And in his subconscious, he was feeling that it was all a preparation for a picnic. So a lot of, ex-relatives came over, these dadas, these didis, they all came over, and he was having a gala time. So he said, yesterday we had a gala time, we had a good picnic, we talked a lot, we laughed a lot, we had a good time. And I said, really? So you didn't tell me, you should have told me, I would have also wanted to participate. That is the way you take a gerontological approach to life after a certain point of time. Let's say after 60, after 70. And with gerontological progression, especially in the realm of cultural gerontology, we are trying to expand the frontier. So at one point of time, it was 50 or 60 was old enough to be old. Now it may be 70, then it is 80. And I think that if you lead a certain kind of life, it might even, be better. Not just in terms of years lived, but in terms of the quality of life led. Okay? So for me, death is a paradox to be resolved, because it's like the proverbial snake with the tail in its mouth, the Ramakrishna Mission logo that you have. And that's the circularity with which we have to understand the equation and the relation between life and death. Okay? I had my daughter's stem cells preserved by a company called LifeCell. It's a costly procedure, nonetheless. But I have been told that stem cells are the things for the future because they can actually heal people up to 4 generations back. Okay? So, of course, my previous 2 generations are gone. But I have some hope of my health activation based on the umbilical cell recordings that my daughter has had when she was born. So this is the advancement that is happening now, which is working wonders. Cryonics or cryogenics is something I am a bit suspicious about, but then liquid nitrogen preservation of the dead has been happening for quite a long time. The question is, what do we do with that? How do we actually see the preservation of a dead? Is it important enough to keep that dead alive in the moment, that dead body or that corpse alive in the moment? You must have heard about several families who cannot accept the passing away of someone. And I have read reports in newspapers that they actually keep the dead body with them. There is a corporeal connection with the corporal that they can't sunder. That verges on the eerie. But at the same time, this has to do with the failure to accept the rites of passage that death leads to. Ultimately, it is surrender. So whether you are dealing with it in biblical terms, dost thou art to dost thou returneth, or whether you're dealing with it in popular terms, like there's a song by Guns N' Roses called Dust and Bones. Your life is your own, do your own thing, because in the end, we are all dust and bones. So come to think of this egalitarianism that death achieves. There is a certain kind of stasis which is necessary for a soul to take a different kind of shape. But here, I would like to point out to something, which is this, that I have been told by the Purohits that it takes several janams, a lot of janams, to make a crossover from a vegetative state to an insect state, from an insect state to an animal state. And then finally we are born as the human. So the human is supposed to be, in terms of the Bhagavad Gita, it's supposed to be the purest form of life expression. Now, I wonder whether I would be saying that in the age of the Anthropocene. But nonetheless, it is true that when the person dies, he has to make fair and square with a lot of paps or crimes committed when that person was living. Now, how would you define that? How would you define what is pap and what is punya? That is a questionable thing in itself, because that would radically affect the way you look at death. Okay? Yeah, sure. So for that, from that aspect, I would say that perhaps that is a reminder of you to revitalize your thinking about what life itself means, so that you would have a more combustible, element of self-participation with other species. There would be this, multi-species cohabitation that we so talk about in posthuman studies and which is so often neglected. Now, due to constraints of time, I would kind of, just skip my explanation of it and just point out the important pointers that I have. This quote struck me very particularly. And this is to say that this is the domain of posthumanism that we talk about. I am in perfect agreement with Francesca when we talk about posthuman ethics, because without a consideration of ethics, you cannot have proper posthuman studies. The ethical dimension of it all is what separates posthumanism from any kind of random transhumanist experimentation. You ought to have a sense of things to make sense of things. And obviously, the residue is something which we all have to take. So when the body is cremated and you have the ultimate ash remaining, I remember Professor Shantanu Biswas having once told me, I was doing a class on psychoanalysis, that ash is the ultimate residue because you can't burn ash further. You have to surrender it to only one entity, which is water. And water is the ultimate shanti, shanti, shanti. So there is a full circle that we all have to come to. And believe me, the best life is that life where before your death, you have that sense of peace that in this limited time frame, I have done what I wanted to do in my limited way. Now, I won't dwell on this any further, but there's a very small portion I'll just talk about before I leave, which is to say that I was working on a concept called cyborgization. Okay, and this is not the habitual Donna Haraway cyborg that came out in the late 80s. And I'm sure all of you have watched Blade Runner and stuff like that. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and Philip Dick's novel and all that. Cyborgization is this concept that we are gradually fusing with bots. So in another 5-10 years, the ones who would be empowered with bot implants more and more would be the ones who would be the advanced species. The ones who would be left out, who wouldn't have the capacity to endow themselves with these technocratic challenges, would be the ones who would be the other. And a new form of subject other is being created. We talk about Gaza victims versus Israeli offenders or this and that. There are different political connotations of that happening all over the world in different political situations. But this is a situation which is highly demonological. And as Amitav Ghosh points out that in a novel called Gun Island, that we have entered the demonological age, which is to confront with the ultimate evil possible. But after that perhaps there is a face-to-face, contact, a kind of proto-narcissistic contact with the self in front of the mirror, where we will have to question several priorities. Like the others before me, and like some of the statements passed by the organizers, I'm also hopeful. I do believe in this hope that there will be positive things picked up, not just the dystopian order that we see around us, and from there we'll be able to make sense of it all. Paul Slovic defines this as the arithmetic of compassion, and that is something that all SESs, social ecological systems, have to deal with in order to make sense of a broader reality. Let me just remind you before I end that, as Agamben pointed out, that there has been a major radical shift. There has been a kind of dynamic shift from classical biopolitics to modern biopolitics. So natural decoding has given way to a biometrical understanding of things. And the Aristotelian eudaimonia that we talk about, the idea of good life itself becomes questionable. Now, I want to ask you this, that should eudaimonia be attributed to the dead? My answer is certainly, because we share a lot of honors and disgraces with our ancestors, and will continue to do that as long as the species remain. And because of this, I think this circulatory trajectory that the Gita teaches us is something that would remain with us. There is no reason at all to vaunt about our technological progress, because on the Kardashev scale, we are not even in type 1. I'm sure you know about the 6 scales of existence that are there. If you are in type 1, you are being able to control the entire energy of your planet. If you are in type 2, you can control the energy of the hot star. If you are in type 3, you can control the energy of the entire. If you are in type 4, the universe, type 5, the multiverse, and the ultimate type that you can aspire to is a ontoepistemic reality that is beyond time and space. It's the highest dimension possible. These are the 6 stages of the Kardashev scale. We are not even in type 1. So, if that be the case, we have to look at death based on what is released from the body after the body is no more. No matter how much you experiment with it, there has to come a time when preservation will also give way to dissipation, when the derelict will also be dead. And this is what the Bhagavad Gita says, with which I end my lecture, chapter 2, verse 24. Achedyo yam adhayo yam akledyo shosha evacha nitya sarvagatas matu achelo yam sanatana. This Atma is unbreakable, incombustible, cannot be dampened, dried, and is everlasting, all-pervading, unalterable, immortal, and primordial. That would be a suitable reminder to everyone in a material, transhuman age today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your valuable insights. Your words have not only deepened our understanding, but also enriched the spirit of inquiry that this conference seeks to foster. Your insights from Hinduism and astral physics have given us a lot to ponder over. From the mythological figures of Yamraj to rituals like Pindan, this non-sensory experiences makes our lives truly post-human.